Thanks for everyone putting in the chat. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Peterson. I'm the Assistant Executive Director for Sigma Alpha Mu Fraternity. And I'm here with my co-host, Sam. Sam, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey everyone. I'm excited to be here. My name is Sam Friday. I serve as the Director of Operations for the fraternity, and I get to partner with Michelle on this webinar.
All right, y'all. So we're going to throw a lot of stuff at you tonight. We're going to go quickly through some of it. We'll go a little bit more detailed through some things. But basically, we're having this to make sure that you all are prepared to start having in-person events. So we will put some stuff in the chat feature as resources, but if you miss it, don't fret. I'm going to send out an email tomorrow morning with links to all of the resources. So if you don't catch it in the chat, you'll get it tomorrow. If you have questions along the way, please put those in the chat, and then we will also leave time at the end. We are going to use the chat feature some. We do have a poll to try to keep this engaging, but if you have questions at any point, just stop Samurai and we're happy to address those. All right, so we're here to talk about in-person events this fall. Some of you have maybe never even been a part of your chapter when you could have events, and probably most of you have not been in a leadership role when in-person events were happening because of the pandemic this past year. So some things we're going to be talking about today are specific to event management and how to run events, but we're going to kick off a little bit here talking about kind of the pandemic. We're not out of it yet. And so what does that look like on your campus? So I think the biggest thing I need you all to take away from here is you need to know what your university guidelines are. Are they allowing in-person events? What are those guidelines? Are they requiring vaccinations? Do people have to wear masks, etc.? So if you do not know the answers to those questions, you need to ask someone. You need to ask IFC, you need to ask your FSL office. You probably just even need to get on your university's website because it might be there. The one thing I will share is that you all, things may change quickly. As we know with the Delta variant, your university may have certain guidelines right now, but depending on how fall semesters go, those may change very quickly. So I think it's going to be important that you all are prepared. One of the things we're going to drop in the chat, and we shared with all the council leaders again this year, is a roadmaps document. So last year when COVID hit, we prepared this document for chapters that really focused on virtual events they could do. And it's all organized based on the different areas within the chapter performance report. We have since updated that document this year to help you all prepare for in-person events, potentially hybrid events. And if we have to pivot back to virtual events, there's information on that as well. So make sure you utilize that resource and share those with the chairmen that are planning your different events. We're going to talk a little bit about what is your chapter plans for COVID safety. But I think the biggest thing to remember here, like I shared, is plans can change quickly, guidelines can change quickly. So just how best are you prepared in order to do that? If you have questions, concerns, you need help, your chapter coach is always here to assist you. A lot of the priors, if you're a prior on the call, you work directly with your chapter coach. But if you're a social chair or a risk manager and you want to talk to someone at headquarters, you have access to that person too. It doesn't just have to be the prior. So make sure you're asking those questions if you have them. So as I think about COVID protocols, some of you have been in school a couple weeks now. Some of you are about ready to start your fall semester or term. But these are the things I need you thinking of. Are you tracking vaccinations of your members and your guests if you're having events? If members aren't vaccinated, are they required to get tested? And if so, how often? What is the chapter's protocol if someone gets COVID? If they're in-house, if you have a fraternity facility, or if they're out of house? Are you requiring masks in common areas, etc.? So I don't necessarily have the answers to these questions. It is different for each of you because of your state requirements. So these are questions that if you all as a council and as chairman have not had discussions about, I need you to take these questions back to your next council meeting and be talking about these and making sure everyone in your chapter is on the same page with what your plan is as a chapter as of right now. This is probably something great for risk managers who are on the call. Every week, there should be no reason you don't have a reported chapter. Reminding people of the guidelines. If there were changes in the last week, make sure you're providing updates. So definitely this is a good role for the risk manager to be keeping the chapter up to date with what the expectations are.
So before we kind of jump into the rest of the presentation, we kind of want to get a gauge of where you're at in terms of social event management and how you feel. If you don't know, that's fine. We get that. But you can, like I said, you can mark that on there. But like I said, it'll give us a good kind of a good baseline so that we can base our, we can maybe change our presentation a little bit. So, cool. I think we'll leave it open for just a little bit, just so everyone can answer that, and we can go from there.
All right, we're sitting at about 33%. They said great. About 43, Sam said good. We did a decent job. We don't have anybody in not the best, so that's good. Sounds like a lot of people on the call. And then we have about 17% that have never attended an event since they've been a member. So a good spread there.
Yeah, no, that'll be, like I said, it'll be really helpful, and hopefully we'll be able to give you guys some tips. If you're saying great and good, I'm gonna take your word for it, and I'm gonna hopefully give you guys some tips that we can use to make it even better. And for those of you who don't know, or we're hopefully gonna, like I said, give you at least the basics, and so that you have an understanding. And if not, we have some great staff that'll be able to help you through that. So I'm ready to keep going, Michelle.
All right. So a couple questions to throw out, and we're just going to ask you to put your response in the chat. So the first question is, as a leader, what are you most concerned about regarding your social events this year? There are no wrong answers. So what are you most concerned about? Being a leader, social events, what's concerning you? Put in the chat feature. Participation. All right. Thanks, Thomas. COVID outbreak. Yep. Attendance. Another attendance. COVID. New to leadership and planning. Appreciate that. Controlling volume of people. Yep, Brian, that's a good one. Attendance. Got a lot of attendance. Brotherhood turnout. Yep. Guidelines. All those are good answers. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about that today and hit on some of those things that you all are mentioning here. The next question I have for you is, as a leader, how are you preparing your members to assist in managing events? So thinking about getting ready to have, maybe some of you have already had in-person events. How are you best preparing your members to assist you in the roles you're sitting in to manage events? Making sure everyone's on the same page. Appreciate that, Jonathan. Adam, love that. Reviewing the risk management policy. Communication, risk management meetings before events. Jack, love that. Staying on top of communication. Yeah, y'all, these are all great things. So keep them coming if you want to, but I think a lot of you hit on it. It's a lot about a communication and setting expectations. So in the roles that all of you are sitting in, making sure that you have very clear expectations on behavior and rules. We can't hold our members accountable if they don't even know what they're being held accountable to. So I definitely encourage you all at your first chapter meeting or your next chapter meeting, making sure that you go over in detail all of these expectations. The risk management policy can be found on our website, and we'll share it at some point in this presentation. Within the risk management policy, you are expected to review the risk management policy at the beginning of every semester or term. So that would be a great thing to do. I would make this as engaging as you can. I've seen some chapters do use like a Jeopardy game. I've seen some chapters break apart the risk management policy, put people in small groups and have them present. You getting up in front and just reading it to people is probably not the most exciting thing for them. But at the end of the day, they need to know and understand that they are being upheld to those standards within the risk management policy. The next one are your chapter bylaws. Likely you have certain criteria in there that you're holding your members accountable to. Your IFC bylaws or your campus rules, your student code of conduct, all of you have that at the campuses you're on. Different ordinances depending on where you live. And then also state and federal laws. So these are all good things. And I know it's not the most fun and exciting thing to do to go over with your members, but these are important because in a little bit, we'll talk about how you're holding people accountable to these things. Be clear and encourage dialogue, right? Because I'd rather a member bring it up to you of like, I don't really understand this rule, why we can't play drinking games. And as you, as the risk manager, the prior, the vice prior, it is your job to share how that is within our risk management policy. And we're going to talk about this here in a little bit, but then how that increases liability for the chapter and risk for the chapter. So we'll hit on those in a minute. We're going to talk through really what an event looks like, but before we do that, I wanted to really talk about phases of intervention. So a lot of things we're going to be talking about in this webinar is that planning phase. How can we best help you all prepare and plan for these events? This is where you're anticipating risk. You're getting everything on paper or on a computer and walking through that with your members. Okay, so that's very much the planning. I would say chapters that really focus on this stage and do this well, it usually prevents a lot of the situations we'll talk about here moving down the page. So planning, we're going to talk about and help you with that. The pre-problem. So this phase is the time for recognizing warning signs and taking action to mitigate the potential problems before it happens. So somebody in the chat mentioned having that risk management meeting before the event starts with the risk management team. This is probably a great opportunity where you're walking around the space, seeing if there's anywhere where someone could trip or fall, or how the distribution center is set up. And could someone get alcohol when they're not supposed to be getting alcohol? So in this pre-problem, you are kind of looking for signs to be able to address in that moment to mitigate risk from happening. Okay, so this is a good one to be focusing on as well. The next phase is the problem, right? This is when things are hitting the fan. And this is where you all as the leaders, and you need to train your risk teams to be able to intervene in the moment. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but this is where action is required. And I think the important thing is making sure that your team, whoever the risk team is that night, is prepared to intervene in that moment. And that could be if someone slips and falls, that can be if someone is too intoxicated, that could be if the cops show up, right? A problem could look various ways, but it's how are we best prepared, and we as a chapter need to be having conversations of how do we deal with this in the moment. If someone needs medical attention, you will hear multiple times throughout this presentation, you will always need to call 911. And then the post problem, this is the part I think people, individuals, and chapters in general, we forget this part. So if a problem did happen, this is very much that follow-up stage, having those conversations, holding people accountable, and how do we best make sure and evaluate what we did in this situation so it doesn't happen again in the future. So this slide, we'll include the slides with the information we share out tomorrow too, but this is probably a great slide for you to go over with your chapter and as a leadership, making sure you all are planning for these different areas.
Sweet. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what constitutes a chapter event. I think this is a really interesting question just because it's gotten very kind of vague almost in terms of what can constitute a chapter event, because it can be a lot of things, right? And I think a lot of times universities at least use the reasonable observer standard for what a chapter event is. And sometimes it can be, if it looks like a Sammy event, it's probably a Sammy event. Sometimes it can be if it's 3 guys wearing Sam shirts, it could be considered a Sammy event. So there's lots of different things that universities can use to ultimately constitute a chapter event. And even if it's not something that's premeditated, or even if it's something that's happening at a satellite house or at a if it's a senior house, these are all things that can even be considered a chapter event. So there's lots of things that we have to be taking in consideration when we're thinking about what a chapter event is or isn't. And it could be unintentional as well, but it's good to know. So we have to determine if it's going to be on a chapter premises. So if it's being hosted at your chapter house, or if you guys have rented space on campus, that could be considered. If it's off campus, or it's a place that could be considered if someone's looking at if there's 8 Sams living there, and that could be being hosted there, that's probably going to be considered a chapter event. If there's any planning involved, or if it was discussed at chapter or a meeting and a formal meeting there, or if chapter funds were used for it, did the officers help plan or attend the event? So if you have any chapter officers there, if we talked about it in group meetings, or we're sending it to other sororities or other organizations on campus, or we have different, or maybe there's Facebook groups or things like that, or we're marketing it that way, or we're letting people know that we're having an event. If guests were stopped on their way, basically, I mean, if you can ask someone where they're headed and they can say that they're going to a Sammy event, that's probably can be considering it. So these are all things that we have to consider when we're looking at what constitutes a chapter event. And it can be unintentional as well, but we have to be able to know how to react in those situations, because even if it's something that was just a few guys hanging out and then people start coming over, we have to be prepared to handle those moments as well. So these are all things that we should be considering when we're thinking through the planning of event, or what the university might consider a chapter event. Michelle, anything to add on that?
No, I think it's just making sure that you know what your university requirements are. For some of your universities, you're expected to register your events. Some of you don't have to. So I think it's just making sure you know what the rules and expectations from your university or IFC are.
Yeah, and so there's going to be lots of things that we can be considered an event by us, and then also by university entities as well. And so on the left hand side, you're going to see ones that are going to be typically approved, whether it's a dry event, there's no alcohol. The one that we recommend, the BYOB, and we're going to talk more about that later. Member in a date event, that could be a formal or a semi-formal or a date function. If you're having a pair or a mixer with another organization or event with another fraternity or sorority, philanthropy events, third-party vendor, another one that we highly recommend doing, and we're going to talk more about that later. Any of the candidate events, so if you're having candidate meetings, those are all considered. Doing sports, third-party chapter facility, parent events, parents weekend, homecoming, alumni weekends, etc. And then on the right, we have ones that are going to be considered high risk. So pretty much all of these we're going to be highly recommending, and some of them are even explicitly talked about in our risk management policy that we shouldn't be doing. Anything that involves water, pools, slip and sides, if it has some sort of a water source, like avoid it like the plague, because those are the ones that you're going to find that people get hurt the most, and we see a lot of insurance claims from that. There's some car smash. That's one that's explicitly stated that we shouldn't be doing in our risk management policy. However, with that, there's a little carrot next to that. If you are dead set on doing a car smash, we can work through that, right? We can talk, because we have to get extra liability insurance. And then we'd also have to make sure that we do everything accordingly, waivers. There's lots of bits and pieces that come with that as well, because there's, like I said, a lot of liability that can come from that. And the last thing we want to do is have to go through the insurance company or file a claim, something like that. Eating contests, that's another one I would avoid. Just because there's lots of liability that comes with that, whether it's people are allergic allergies or food preparation. There's lots of pieces there that you probably just don't want to get your hands on, because at the end of the day, it's going to cause more headaches for you, and that means it's going to cause more headaches for us. And we want to make sure that everyone is safe. And like I said, our priority is making sure y'all are safe, and then y'all's priority should be making sure you, your brothers, your guests are safe. So that we can, like I said, continue to have great events, but also make sure that they're safe.
Yeah, and one thing we'll include in the email we send out tomorrow is a sample waiver. So at the end of the day, waivers I think are good. If you are, I was working with a chapter, I think we're having a football recruitment event, and I had a conversation of like, we may want to have people sign waivers to try to take that liability off the chapter. At the end of the day, right, if someone gets hurt, so our insurance policy is a liability coverage that covers the chapter and then the chapter leadership, basically from being sued. So if an individual gets hurt at one of your events, they are not covered under that. This is not covered medical. So there's a good waiver example that I worked with another chapter on that I will put in the sample email tomorrow. If you're doing any type of those sporting events or anything else, you can have people sign it. I think that's helpful, and save that document so they know them participating in the activity. They are taking that liability on if they would get injured. All right, so I can talk about the fun stuff, the policies and procedures. So as I mentioned, our risk management policy is found on sam.org/risk. These are the basics, and you will see on there, I'm going to give you kind of the raw and straightforward overview of them all. So the first one, don't break the law. And this includes not serving minors. So per our risk management policy, the chapter members and guests must comply with federal, state, and local laws. No person under the legal drinking age may possess, consume, provide, or be provided alcoholic beverage. So this one is pretty simple. The drinking age in the United States is 21. So anyone who consumes alcoholic beverages under that runs the risk of getting in trouble. And if you are allowing that to happen at your chapter or your chapter events, you're running that risk as well. The next one, no illegal drugs in the chapter. So this one is pretty cut and dry. There is a zero tolerance for chapters who have illegal drugs or controlled substances on chapter premises and or at chapter events. That was pretty cut and dry. No bulk quantities. So common sources of alcohol, including bulk quantities, which are not being served by a licensed and insured third-party vendor, are prohibited. So this is your cases, these are your kegs, this is your big tub of jungle juice. All those things are prohibited because they encourage mass consumption of alcohol. So those are things that you shouldn't be having at your events because they do provide for a riskier environment for you all to manage. The next one is no chapter can purchase alcohol. And so alcoholic beverages cannot be purchased through chapter funds or even pooling money together and one person going and buying all the alcohol. There's a lot of liability in this, y'all. So if something were to happen and it gets back that the chapter purchased the alcohol, that is going to be a lawsuit for sure. But even if I am the one, we pulled the money, Michelle goes and buys all the alcohol, now me as the individual is also going to be liable. So I think those are things to consider and think about. We're going to really go through third-party vendor and BYOB. Those are the two best ways to be running your events to make sure that you are not setting yourself as an individual or the chapter up to be liable for purchasing alcohol for others. And then the other thing is, like, the fraternity is not a bar, right? So we are not in the business of providing alcohol to people. You are not a bar. So that's something to remember and consider because there's a huge risk that comes with that. Third party vendor or BYOB. So basically what this means is those are the two options you have for having events with alcohol. Third party vendor means that you are either renting a space, so a bar, a restaurant, I'm trying to think, anywhere else, right, that serves alcohol. You are reserving that space and they are doing a cash bar there. Or maybe you are hiring a catering company to come into your event and run a cash bar out of your chapter facility or your event. So you may be paying them to be there, but there's no chapter funds are going towards the alcohol. The other option is BYOB, bring your own beverage. So these are your friends who are of age 21 or older. They bring their own alcohol to your event, and we're going to walk you through what that process looks like here in a second. So those are the two options you have. You will see within our risk management policy, hard alcohol is prohibited at any event unless it's served by a licensed and insured third-party vendor. You're like, Michelle, what does this mean? This means hard alcohol cannot be in your chapter facility at all unless it's served by a third-party vendor. So if you're like, Michelle, I'm 21 and I live in the fraternity house, can I have a handle of vodka in my room? No, you cannot. Per this policy, that would be in violation of that. The only way you can have hard alcohol is if it's served by a licensed and insured third-party vendor. All right, no open parties. So per our risk management policy, open parties are prohibited. So we have a 2-to-1 guest list. So for every one brother, they get 2 dates. And we're going to talk about how do you best build your guest list here in a second. And the other thing too is making sure that you are in compliance with fire code. So if you have a chapter facility, it's really important that you know what that max capacity is. And the same is true if you're renting out a third-party vendor, they likely know what those fire codes are and making sure you're staying within that. There's no co-sponsor with distributors. So this means like you all cannot co-host an event with a bar, an event promoter, an alcohol distributor, any of those things. You can rent space at those venues, but you cannot co-host something with any of those things that I mentioned. The all or nothing rule. So a chapter cannot co-host or co-sponsor or any way participate in an activity or event where another group or entity that purchases or provides alcohol. So what if you're going to have an event with another fraternity on campus? You're going to co-host this event. If that other fraternity is using chapter funds or giving out alcohol at the event, but maybe you are not, at the end of the day, it's a joint event, you are going to be just as liable. So I would make sure that you are smart about who you are pairing with, who you are partnering with to host events. And I think the other thing that's going to be really important, especially for my social chairs that are on the call, is having a meeting with those people in advance, probably a few weeks in advance, maybe another check-in meeting that week. So you and them are on the same page of what the rules are, how you all are going to run the event. Because if anything happens, it's the both of you. If it's a co-hosted event, you both are responsible if something happens. The next one is a substance-free joining process and candidate education process. So a lot of us are in recruitment right now. Some chapters have already finished recruitment. There can be absolutely no alcohol involved in the recruitment process. If you are having a recruitment events, there cannot be alcohol there. I already have one chapter who has violated that, and they've already received their show cause letter from the standards committee. So this is one that right is very important, because if we are bringing people into our organizations with alcohol, one that may be impacting their judgment on whether they want to be a part of your chapter or not. But then sometimes we wonder, when we do allow those people in and all they want to do is the social stuff. Well, of course that's the case, because that's what you sold them on, right? You sold them at a party, you sold them that party culture. So that's a piece of why this is alcohol is prohibited at recruitment events. And the other big piece is candidate education activities or events. So there can be absolutely no alcohol associated with the candidate education process. That means meetings, events. The three riskiest nights in the fraternity world are bid night, big little night, and initiation night, y'all. Around the country, those continue to be the most riskiest nights in our industry. So there should be no alcohol at any of those. And as you all, as risk managers and upper leadership, you have to ensure that's happening. We are sharing that. We also have mandatory trainings for your candidate educators, and we share that with them as well. But it's helpful for you all to be aware and know as well. And then lastly, no drinking games. So the chapter and members or guests must not permit, encourage, glorify, or participate in any activities, including the rapid consumption of alcohol, which usually a drinking game does. So that's why you see that there as well. Y'all, you see all these rules. These are just not Sigma Alpha Mu's rules. Most NIC organizations, so those other fraternities on your campus, have the exact same rules as you. They may not be following them, but I guarantee you they are almost exactly the same, or if not very close to us. So this is the expectation across the fraternal community. Just want to make sure you knew that you're like, man, Michelle, we got rules. No, everybody's got rules. It's just, are we abiding by them and upholding those standards or not?
All right, let's talk about the fun stuff, contracts. These are what sometimes, and if you've attended any CLD, typically this comes up as one of the things that we don't necessarily think about, or something that we overlook, and something that can be considered a high risk piece. A lot of the times when we're thinking about contracts, it's I think of it almost as like your Apple terms and conditions, right? You have like 50 pages and you just hit accept because that's what we're trained to do, and that's what we do because we're trusting that whoever or the other party involved is not going to take advantage of us. And while that would be fine and dandy, sometimes that's not always the case, and sometimes there's fine print and details that we overlook that could come back to nip us in the bud. And these are things that we want to make sure that we avoid from the get-go. So for like things right off the bat, you want to make sure that the name that you're signing on for your organization is your chapter name, right? So it would be and this example is the TA chapter of Sigma Alpha Mu. And we want to make sure that we're doing this because if you put Sigma Alpha Mu fraternity, that puts the entire organization under risk and at liability for that. So again, this is important because we want to make sure that it's specific to your organization. If we're working with any professional services, if we're doing getting hotel blocks, if we're doing catering, security, alcohol, cleaning services, sanitation, transportation to or from events, they must be licensed and insured. If they're not licensed and insured, we cannot get into a contract with them because that puts the liability onto us, and that's not what we're trying to do in this, and that's an unnecessary liability that will ultimately come back to hurt you as chapter officers or leaders. The contract must be reviewed by an advisor, or if you don't have an advisor, send it to us at headquarters, and we're more than happy to check that for you. Because, like I said before, sometimes there's bits and pieces in there that we might not read. Like, for instance, if there's a food, you have to spend X amount of money or something like that, or if we don't hit that, then they'll come after you. Or a good example is a chapter did a formal or alumni event. Were supposed to have 100 rooms blocked for their hotel. They only had 30 by the time the event came, and then the hotel or the company that was said, okay, time to pay the piper. We need you where the rest of these 70 rooms that you guys were promising us. And so ultimately there was some quick work to be done, but These are all things that we have to be aware of as we're signing contracts. So like never sign a contract without having another set of eyes. And like I said, specifically us or your advisor, because they'll be at least have some experience with that. The prior should be the one signing the contract, so not the social chair, not the vice prior. Always the prior should be signing the contracts. And if a vendor is asking to be listed as an additional insured or indemnification language, you have to reach out to us for assistance before signing that, so we can work with our insurance partners to make sure that we can get that properly done. And get that taken care of. Typically, and on the right-hand side, you'll see a list of entities or organizations that will typically require contracts: caterers, security, transportation, third-party vendors. Lots of different, like I said, there's a handful of different ones there. But at the end of the day, like I said, if you have questions or you're not sure, always just have like I said, send it to us and we're more than happy to help you. And we want to make sure that you guys are successful.
All right, so a couple questions for you here. Put them in the chat feature, your responses. So what do chapters need to consider in this pre-event planning phase? So we're thinking about starting to plan events. What do you need to consider? Put that in the chat. We're in the pre-event planning phase, starting to prepare and plan for events. What things do you need to consider? Risk assessment. Yep, Jake. Yep, the risks that could happen. Who's going to be there? A list. I like that. What time is going to start? Yeah. What are the start and end times? If we're going to have alcohol or if it's going to be a dry event. The cost. I like that one. That's a good one. How we're going to do alcohol is going to be BYOB or third party vendor. Yeah, those are all good things. Keep them coming. So a couple things. This is really where we're talking through the who, what, where, when, why, and how, right? Thinking of all those different details. Matthew, appreciate the COVID regulations and how we're going to manage that. Someone else, I appreciate Matthew, you hit budget. Yeah. As social chairs who are on here, you likely have a certain budget that you get to work with. So making sure that if you have a certain budget for the entire semester, how does this specific event fit within that budget? So that's a good thing to consider. Someone mentioned, how is the alcohol going to be managed? So yeah, is it going to be the BYOB or is it going to be a third party vendor event? And one other thing that we'll include in the email we send out tomorrow is an event planning form. So this is something within the chapter performance report. You, as a chapter, should be using some type of event management form. In the email I send you tomorrow, I'll provide you 2 samples. I have one chapter that made their event planning form into a Google Doc, and their social chair fills it out within the Google Doc or the Google form, and then that way they always have that information electronically. And then I have other chapters that have Google Docs where they fill in information and save that. So those are all good things, and we'll provide you some samples. But the more that you can have things detailed out, written down, to be able to go over that with your chapter and your risk team, the better that will be. And then the next question I have for you, when thinking about some events, and I'm being very general and broad, but how far in advance should you start planning? How far in advance do you think you need to start planning for an event? 3 to 4 weeks. Thanks, Aaron. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 to 4. Depends on the type of event. Appreciate that. A month. Yeah, it really just depends. So some of your smaller events, maybe if it's just a brotherhood event, those ones probably don't take as much. If you're doing a philanthropy event, that likely has more time involved because you're going to be advertising it. If you are doing events where you're co-hosting or having mixers with other organizations, that probably needs 3 to 4 weeks because you got to work with other organizations. If you are having any large scale event, so if you are having a concert, if you are doing a philanthropy event and you're trying to reserve your intramural fields, if you have something where it's going to be registration, maybe you're doing a golf outing for an alumni event. It's really looking at what is the event at hand, and what all needs to get done. And that's really starting then figuring out the date of the event and working backwards. So I think the more that you can start planning in advance, the better your event will be. And that way you can catch any of those pre-programming problems right in advance and be able to pivot quickly and adjust as needed. I think the other thing to think about too is based on events, if there is going to be alcohol present, having a risk team in place. And even for some of your other events where alcohol isn't present, it's still good to have a risk team. But right, like how are we selecting those people and making sure they have enough notice as well? So a lot of things to consider. There's no one right answer to this. It's really just dependent on the event. And I would say the better to be prepared is usually starting earlier.
Cool. Let's talk about things to consider. We're going to keep this brief and to the point. Theme. When you're thinking about theme, this has been a hot topic, I think, in a lot of recent times. But it should not be disrespectful, degrading to any persons or population. So we shouldn't be appropriating anyone's culture. We're not encouraging people to offensively dress up or costumes. Could the theme bring discredit to the organization? So really, if you have to even think about whether the theme should or be appropriate or not, just pick another theme. I think it's as easy as that. Or if you have questions, like I said, shoot me a text or shoot me an email, and I'm happy to tell you whether it's good or not. The last thing we need is you guys showing up in the news for something silly like a theme of a party. Because if you haven't checked the news recently, there's been lots of fraternities in the news, and the last thing we want is for you to be one of those. The event setup, making sure that we're decorating, that if and when we are decorating, that the decorations are appropriate, that they're not going to hurt someone if something were to happen, making sure that they're set up an appropriate amount of time, or that if there's any risk that can be involved with that we're taking care of that, and no one can get hurt from something, whether it's a loose nail or something like that. So think things through about that. Block off areas that attendees are not welcome. So if we don't want people going into maybe, I don't know, people go into our bedrooms or anything like that, let's block it off. The last thing we need is people stealing something or something unwanted happening during the event. For that, making sure we have signs for emergency exits. That's important so that people know where to go in case of an emergency. You also want to make sure that there's posted placards of where people go during that time as well. So think through that. Risk team training and prep. You want to make sure, obviously, this is done prior to the event. You want to have your risk team selected well in advance and that they've gone through training. Some universities require risk teams go through their own training. If not, you can do your own with that. If you are going to have candidates involved in that, you have to make sure that it's not only candidates. Again, most of the times, you're having with 18-year-olds who have never done anything like this before, and sometimes there's going to be some high pressure, high risk situations, and it's always helpful to have some seniority and some upperclassmen and people with experience involved. If you can hire security, that's always recommended as well, because they're going to be more likely to know how to handle those situations and react in a proper manner, and it takes some of the responsibility off of you. Transportation, if we're busing people places or having a campus safe red program, we can have that in place. We don't want to be acting as DDs for people. We can call people lifts, but we should not be chauffeuring or shuttling people back and forth, because that can end up being ultimately, like I said, a liability for us. Let's talk a little bit about risk team rules. You want to make sure you have an officer in charge of the event, whether it's the VP of risk or you have a risk manager. The prior, should always be one council member who's in charge of the event. If everyone's involved or participating, that's great, but you should always have someone who's the designated point person. If you're on the risk team, this should be pretty straightforward, but you should be sober before, during, and after the event, just to make sure you're a sound mind and judgment during this. It varies on what you do for how many risk managers. Some universities have different numbers. We always recommend 1 to 10, one risk manager to 10 to 15 attendees. This is up to you. You can always have more. You can, like I said, it can never hurt to have two more. To have more, they need to be easily identifiable. So whether they're wearing vests, neon shirts, or whatever you want to do to make sure that people know who they can go to in a time of need, so they're easily identifiable. This also, make sure if you're doing a pair or doing a mixer, that whoever the other organization has risk people as well, and they're also identified, and you guys have a plan of action for including them as well. You want to make sure people are prepared to respond and take action, and if they are uncomfortable taking action, they know who that they can get in touch with. So if I'm uncomfortable handling a drunk brother, I can go to Michelle and make sure that she's the one who knows that's who we're going to handle and how we're going to do with that. If people aren't comfortable doing that, they might not be the best people involved for the risk team, and they can be involved in some other way. Different stations that you're going to want to have people checking doors and IDs. So if you have hired security, you can have someone there helping, assisting with that, with the guest list, manning that. We're going to talk a little bit about managing the guest list and what that looks like. Roamers, people walking through the events, making sure that they're easily identifiable and people can approach them. So you're going to have people at the distribution center. They have to be 21 for this as well. And sometimes universities, again, require that they go through a specific, like sometimes it's ATPS, I want to say, training and other trainings before they can do that. And then also stationed outside the restroom or by the stairs. And by the exits as well, making sure those exits are secured so that we're not having people coming in and out. We want one entrance, one exit. And so if people leave through a side exit, but they're not coming back in through that, and we're not having unwanted guests coming in through the doors that we don't want, that were blocked off. So those are all the different rules and stations that you should have, at least be considering for your risk team.
Oh, sorry, y'all. Okay, so crisis management plan, emergency plan. So there's a lot on this slide. I'm not going to read through all of it, but I want to highlight a few things. So the prior is in command in any emergency situation. In the absence of the prior, it's the vice prior, and then it works down the line. So this is really important for everyone in your chapter to know, because the prior is always the one in charge. But let's say maybe the prior was not the officer in charge at a specific event. Maybe the prior is of age, so maybe he's had a few cocktails or beers. Cocktails if served by a third-party vendor. So then if something happens, then the vice prior should be the one in charge representing the chapter. So at the end of the day, if anyone needs medical attention, the first step always has to be call 911 to get the appropriate emergency personnel there. Whether that's police, fire, the ambulance, etc. Within on the same page, you can get to the risk management plan. You can also get to the Good Samaritan policy. So we have a Good Samaritan policy that basically says, as an individual or as a chapter, if someone is in need of medical attention and you get them that medical attention immediately, there will likely be less consequences as you all as individuals and as a chapter. Almost every single one of your universities has that same policy, because at the end of the day, we want you to get someone help if they need it. So making sure you're doing that. Some of the other things are here more specific to depending if you're in a house, making sure that you are kind of controlling the guests. So appropriate, like I said, emergency personnel can get into the event. Do not tamper with any evidence. Depending what the situation is at hand, that may be something where police or other people have to come in. So do not tamper with anything. This would be a good opportunity for you to call your headquarters chapter coach, your chapter advisor, and probably any appropriate campus officials. And there's some other things here, but at the end of the day, fully cooperate with authorities. So I had a prior meeting a couple weeks ago. I reviewed this in detail with all of your priors, so they know, but I think for you all to make sure you're passing on, I think the biggest thing to know here is at the end of the day, the prior is in command in an emergency situation. Our headquarters staff will assist and help as we learn information from the prior and making sure that you all are following proper steps and really, like I said, cooperating with authorities. So we'll have you fill out an incident form to get information, especially if someone was injured or there was property damage that occurred, but we'll walk you through those steps. So the other thing too to mention here is the prior is the only one who can speak on behalf of the chapter. And so if we have a newspaper trying to get a quote or a reporter trying to get information, it's really important for you to share with the entire chapter that the prior is the only one who can speak on behalf of the chapter. And even in that sense, our staff, we have a PR firm on retainer, and we will help you with that depending on what the situation is. So at the end of the day, prior's in charge. Prior's the one representing the chapter.
All right, let's talk about my favorite thing, building the guest list. I think this is a really unique part of the event that kind of gets overlooked a lot, and we probably can do a lot better job as fraternity men with our guest list as well. So things that you want to consider, you want to know any of the number of guests that are allowed at your event. Per our policy, it's 2 guests per member, new member at an event. If the university has more or less, that's good to keep in mind. Whatever policy is stricter, that's the one you want to follow, because you're not going to get in trouble that way. I think that's a good thing to think about. Things you want to have on the guest list, and this is the important stuff, folks. You want to have their name, age, email, phone number, contact information. That's good stuff to have. Time entered, time left, notes. And why do we want to have time entered and time left? I think this is the part that's important, as if someone shows up at your event, they're maybe a little intoxicated, they get there, we happen to let them in, they're there for 10 minutes and they leave, they black out, they have to go to the hospital, and they wake up and the last place they remember being is at the Sammy house, and you have no record of them being there or leaving, then the university is probably going to go based off that, and we have nothing that we can say we can prove. So if we're keeping detailed notes and keeping detailed time entered and left, you're going to be able to cover yourselves and be able to say, no, look, this is when they were here, this is when they left, there's no way. So it's good for you guys to be keeping this, in the detailed notes section is really important. You want to be keeping these lists for up to a year. And I think it's important also to know where you're keeping it. So whether you're keeping it in your HQ docs in your MySam, whether you're keeping it in a Google Drive, whether you're keeping it in a shared Dropbox, whatever you're doing, I don't care. Just make sure you have a shared location, and everyone, or at least people of importance, know where it's at, right? All council knows where it's at, all risk, incoming transitions know where it's at. So that's why it's important for that. Members are responsible for the behavior of their guests. So if I'm bringing Michelle to an event and she does something that causes damage, I'm going to be the one who's responsible for that, and that should be the policy for anything that happens. So if one of your guests shows up and they break something, you're going to be held responsible, and then it'll be your responsibility to either hold them responsible or follow up through on that. There's different options to create a guest list. I think there's tons of different ways. You could use a Google sheet. You could have brothers go in and fill it out that way. You could have a Google form, have people submit information that way. You could do a closed Facebook group. There's event apps that you can get that'll track all this information as well. So it's recommended, though, that you close this at least 24 hours prior to the event. I always say more, if you can, just so that you have a closed list and you can get everything taken care of and submitted if you have to through university ahead of time, and you don't have to worry about people changing things at the last minute. And one thing that I think is something that we could possibly do, and I think it would be great for expectations and holding people accountable, is sending out information, or people knowing what the expectations are, and the information. So whether you're sending that out, if you're having contact information, sending out as a mass text or sending it out as an email, and you can say you've done your due diligence. And so if people start acting a fool and you're like, I need to remove you from the event, and they're starting to complain, you can say, look, you knew the expectations and you violated that. Same thing if you're going to a concert or anything like that. Before you go, you're going to get an email from the venue saying, this is what you can and can't do. Absolutely no reason why we as fraternity men hosting an event shouldn't do something similar as well. So that's why I think building a guest list and having a good built out guest list is one of the most important parts of the event planning process. Cool. BYOB, if you didn't know, now you know. BYOB is at least the only method that we allow for if you're having alcohol at your events, if it's on your premise and not through a third-party vendor. You need to have some sort of identification system for identifying people who are of 21 or under. Sometimes you do X on the hand for under 21. Over 21, you might do wristband. I recommend doing custom wrist. If you can afford it, they're pretty cheap. You can do custom wristbands for every event, because last thing you need is someone buying a 100-pack of neon orange wristbands and then putting it on after you get to your event. That's just going to cause problems for everyone. So I think figure that out, what's going to work best for you. Like I said, they're relatively affordable, but have a method and stick with it. I think that's the important piece. Drinks allowed. If you're over 21, you can have a 6-pack of individual cans. Wine has to be box wines. You can't have bottles. Seltzers has to be below 15% ABV though. So that's the important piece to remember, keep in mind. So people try to show up with handles, or people show up with more than a 6-pack for themselves. That's not allowed. If 2 people show up and they're splitting a 12-pack, we can talk about that, but you need to make sure you have an effective system for identifying what that is when we're talking a little bit about that. We talked about earlier, whoever's managing the distribution center needs to be over 21, needs to be in a central location. and you need to make sure that it's secure so people cannot sneak in and take things, or people can't mess with it. And you want to have more than one person. You want 2 or more actually working in that area. Guests should only be having 1 drink at a time, and they'll have to bring it back or show that it's been disposed of before they can get their next drink. And then we talked about the system. Think about what you're going to use. The ticket system. Some people have a ticket, and you're going to give them 6 tickets, and once those 6 are gone, then you're done. Some people do a punch card. I've seen some that have wristbands that have pull-off tabs that you can do. Like I said, if you're feeling bougie and you want to get some of those, you can do that. But like I said, think about your system. Make sure everyone in the chapter knows what the system is. Make sure your guests know what the system is, and then follow through on that. And keep it consistent. Don't be switching it up. It doesn't make sense, and you're only going to make things more complicated for yourself. If you have leftover alcohol, people can pick it up the next day if they're too drunk. Like I said, you don't need to be giving people alcohol and then them leaving and then something happening. That's something you don't need on your conscience. And then create a map of your space so you know where things are going to be: emergency exits, risk team stations, areas that are blocked off where the distribution center is, etc. Like we said, candidates should not be working on the risk team alone, and they definitely should not be working the bar or the distribution center. So that is what there is to know about having a BYOB event. If you have questions about it, don't hesitate to shoot us a chat or shoot us a text, and we're happy to follow up on that with you.
And one thing too, if you are like one of the people who said, I've never had an event or not been in the chapter. So we at headquarters have a mock event that we can work with your chapter advisor, depending how close you are to headquarters, potentially come over and run a mock event with you so you can practice running a BYOB event. So if that's something you're interested in, let your chapter coach know, and we'll make sure we can provide you that information so you can practice this maybe before you have your first BYOB event. All right, so accountability, right? So we have set expectations for people. We have done everything we can to pre-plan, thinking of all the things, planning the event, running through the event. And so these are the things to think about. So prevention, we've already hit on that. It's having that clear and concise plan and procedures, and making sure we're communicating that to our members and guests in advance to help reduce risk. The next one is to intervene in the moment. And those are some of the things we talked about earlier as well. So this is being an upstander instead of being a bystander, right? So if you see a situation that is in need of medical attention or is against policy or fraternity values, doing something in that moment. If you do not feel comfortable, right, then get help. Find someone who does feel comfortable. And I think that Sam mentioned earlier, being on risk team, right, being the vice prior, being the one holding people accountable, it's hard. But if we don't do that well, there is potential that things could happen. So how can we best make it clear in holding our guests and our members accountable? And then the last one is holding people accountable if and when something happens, right? So most of you, all of you should have a judicial board or a standards board. If you're like, Michelle, we do not have one of those, or we do, but it's not up and running yet. Sam put a guide in the chat feature that has sample just overall processes, sample charge letter, sample hearing, anything you need to know to hold people accountable. So I will share, I'm the staff member that is the liaison to the International Standards Committee. And if your chapter is doing a good job holding its own members accountable, then things don't rise to the level of becoming a chapter issue. I had a chapter last semester who had a situation with a member at one of their events. The chapter ended up getting kind of investigative notice because we were made aware of it because the chapter prior told us, and they provided more information. But they had already held that member accountable through their own J board process and actually elected to remove him from the chapter. So they submitted all that information over to the International Standards Committee, and the Standards Committee that blessed that, right? Like there were no additional sanctions that came to the chapter. They said, you did what you're supposed to do. You all held your peers accountable. Good job. So I think the more that you can be very clear and have good accountability within your chapter and your members, the better that will be for your chapter. It is when we are not holding our members accountable that things start to snowball, and then it ends up being a chapter issue. I don't know why my clicker isn't working. All right, y'all. So one of the other, like I said, we're going to send a follow-up email tomorrow with all the different links. We'll talk about, there's some additional resources that we talked about here, or maybe didn't, that we'll include as there as well. So if you have any questions as you're preparing for your first event, or maybe you've already had your first event, making sure that you are communicating with your chapter coach, we're here to help you. We can do some practice mock events with you. If you are having a larger event, I have a couple chapters who have concerts. Depending if you are having a very large scale event, there is potential that you would need additional insurance for that. So if that's something that you're like, oh, we do this every year, that's probably a good thing to be talking to your chapter coach about, to see if you need to increase your liability insurance as a chapter. But we're happy to help walk you through that. So at the end of the day, if you have questions, Sam and I will hold back for a little bit. We hope you all have a fun, but also safe fall semester. And we're here to help you in any way that we can in this pre-planning, planning, and even accountability stage. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Have a good night. We will hang back if people have questions, and if not, we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.